What if three cities on three different continents all grew from nothing in a single generation, and every official record struggles to explain how? Not one city, three, separated by thousands of miles, following the same impossible sequence, the same explosive growth, the same catastrophic destruction, the same defiant rebuilding, and then the same grand celebration thrown for the watching world. I spent weeks inside census archives, construction records, and government documents. What I found doesn't belong to fringe theory or lost civilization mythology. It belongs to official data. And official data, when you stare at it long enough, sometimes stops making sense. Start with Melbourne, because Melbourne might be the most extraordinary case of the three. The year is 1836. An official census counts the entire settlement, 177 people. Only 35 of them are women. No paved roads, no stone buildings, no infrastructure of any kind beyond a scattering of rough timber shelters. The settlement exists because 1 year earlier, a man named John Batman stepped off a boat, walked to the edge of the Yarra River, and said the words, "This will be the place for a village." That is the founding. A man points at a riverbank. A government surveyor named Robert Hoddle arrives the following year and draws a street grid. And from that grid, from those 177 souls, something begins that no conventional explanation has ever fully accounted for. By 1851, the population had climbed to roughly 29,000. Then gold was discovered in Victoria. Within months, it doubled to 40,000. In 1852 alone, somewhere between 75,000 and 90,000 immigrants stepped off ships at Melbourne's docks. In 1 year, more people arrived than the entire existing population. The colony surged from 77,000 in 1851 to over 538,000 by 1861, a seven-fold increase inside a single decade. By 1865, Melbourne had overtaken Sydney, a city with a 50-year head start. That advantage was erased in barely 10 years. But population numbers alone don't capture what was happening on the ground. During the 1850s and 1860s, construction crews broke ground on Parliament House, the Treasury Building, the old Melbourne Jail, the State Library, the University of Melbourne, the General Post Office, the Customs House, and Melbourne Town Hall. These are not frontier cabins thrown up in a hurry. These are grand civic structures built from bluestone and imported materials, designed in classical European styles that rivaled anything standing in London. The foundation stone of St. Patrick's Catholic Cathedral was laid in 1858. St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral was begun in 1880. St. Paul's was designed by a man named William Butterfield. Butterfield worked from England. He drafted the plans, specified every material, and directed the project through correspondence alone. He never once set foot in Melbourne, not for the groundbreaking, not for the completion, not at any point in his life. An American businessman named George Train visited Melbourne during this period of violent expansion. He had also seen Chicago, Cincinnati, and San Francisco. He compared all of them and arrived at the same conclusion for each. He called them babes in the wood in the morning who had become full-grown men at night. He wasn't reaching for a poetic image, he was describing something that visibly startled him. Cities that appeared fully formed at speeds that no one standing inside them could rationally explain. Then there is the labor question, which almost no one raises. Melbourne's stonemasons organized, coordinated, and won the 8-hour workday in 1856, the first successful 8-hour movement anywhere on Earth. Not London, not Paris, not New York. A frontier settlement that had been a riverbank campsite 21 years earlier produced the world's first organized labor victory of that scale. If you have ever tried to build anything from scratch, a business, a team, a neighborhood coalition, you understand what coordination actually requires.
Infrastructure, trust networks, institutional memory, years of groundwork. Yet here it emerged, fully operational, in a city that barely existed 2 decades prior. Gold brought money, that much is documented. Over £100 million worth of gold flowed through Victoria. But money does not cut stone. Money does not transmit classical masonry technique across generations in real time. Money does not commission a cathedral from 6,000 miles away and guarantee the result will stand for centuries. The official explanation requires every specialized trade to have arrived simultaneously, organized immediately, and built at a pace that modern construction firms with power tools and GPS surveying would consider ambitious. It is possible, but it strains credibility when you actually sit with the arithmetic. Now take that same pattern and carry it to Chicago. In 1833, the town of Chicago was formally established with a population of roughly 200 people. The census of 1840 recorded 4,470. By 1850, nearly 30,000. By 1860, over 112,000. By 1870, almost 300,000, the 5th largest city in America, the fastest sustained urban growth of any major city in the nation's history. Then, on October 8, 1871, it burned. The Great Chicago Fire consumed more than 17,000 structures across roughly 2,100 acres. It erased 73 miles of road and 120 miles of wooden sidewalk. Around 300 people died. Over 100,000 lost their homes. The damage totaled approximately $222 million, nearly a third of Chicago's entire assessed value, gone in under 48 hours. The story most people know is that Chicago rose heroically from those ashes. It did. But the details of how it rose are far more unsettling than the legend allows. Between 1872 and 1879, over 10,000 building permits were issued. The city rebuilt at a pace that astonished outside observers. But according to architectural historians, not a single meaningful improvement in fireproofing was incorporated into the reconstruction. The city that burned because it was built from wood was rebuilt from wood. No one had yet solved how to fireproof iron or timber at that scale, and the economic pressure to rebuild was too intense for experimentation, so they used what they knew. You can probably anticipate what followed. In 1874, a second fire tore through Chicago. It consumed 50 acres and roughly 800 structures in the newly rebuilt sections. A historian at the Chicago History Museum described it with brutal simplicity. Those neighborhoods burned because they had been constructed essentially the same way as before. 2 fires, 3 years apart, exact same materials, exact same results. Almost no version of Chicago's celebrated resurrection includes this chapter. And yet, despite burning twice in 36 months, Chicago's population crossed 500,000 by 1880 and reached 1 million by 1890. In 20 years, the population had tripled. In that exact window, something happened that permanently altered the history of architecture. In 1885, the home insurance building was completed using a steel frame skeleton, the first true skyscraper ever constructed. The Montauk Block became the first building anywhere in the world erected under electric lighting at night.
Chicago didn't simply recover, it rewrote how buildings get made. From wooden sidewalks to the birthplace of the skyscraper. 14 years. And to announce that transformation to the world, Chicago hosted the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. 27 million people attended. Researchers have noted that the fire recovery narrative was central to winning the bid. The destruction was the credential. The argument was implicit and overwhelming. Look at what we built. Look at how fast we did it. One researcher put it plainly, the fair would almost certainly never have come to Chicago without the fire. Think about that for a moment. The catastrophe became the proof of worthiness.
There is one more detail most people walk past without registering. Millions of tons of rubble from the Great Fire were loaded up and dumped into Lake Michigan. That rubble became the landfill that eventually became Grant Park. If you have ever spent a summer afternoon there, you were standing on top of the old city. The destroyed version of Chicago is directly beneath your feet. Now San Francisco, because this is where the pattern completes in a way I find genuinely difficult to set aside. In 1844, the settlement of Yerba Buena contained roughly a dozen houses and fewer than 50 residents. By April of 1848, it had grown to perhaps 200 buildings and around 1,000 people. Then gold was discovered at Sutter Mill. Between January 1848 and December 1849, San Francisco's population detonated from 1,000 to 25,000 in under 2 years. By 1853, an estimated 100,000. By 1870, nearly 150,000. By 1906, roughly 400,000 people called it home. It was the undisputed financial and cultural capital of the American West. At 5:12 on the morning of April 18, 1906, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck. The shaking lasted 42 seconds. The fires that followed burned for 4 days. More than 80% of the city was destroyed. 28,000 buildings were gone. Over 3,000 people died. 250,000 were left with nothing. What happened next is where the documented record starts to fracture. Business leaders understood with cold clarity that any delay in reconstruction would permanently redirect economic power toward Los Angeles. Speed was elevated above every other consideration, including public safety. Building codes were relaxed by approximately 50%. They would not return to pre-1906 standards until the 1950s, nearly half a century of weakened construction requirements. Commercial property owners could rebuild structures up to 1 story without obtaining a permit at all. When the governor of California issued his first public statement about the disaster, he described the fire. He described the rebuilding effort. He expressed confidence in the city's future. He did not use the word earthquake, not once in the entire statement. The reason was specific and documented. Insurance policies covered fire damage. They did not cover earthquake damage. Property owners, and this appears in multiple first-hand accounts, deliberately set fire to their own buildings. A United States Army officer, Captain Leonard Wildman, reported being stopped by a fireman who told him directly, "People in this neighborhood are burning their own houses." They were told they would not collect insurance unless the damage was caused by fire. This is not a rumor passed down through generations. This is a military officer's documented account. The reconstruction of San Francisco was built on a foundation of suppressed information, deliberate insurance fraud, and building codes intentionally cut in half. And within 3 years, more than 20,000 new buildings had been erected. By 1915, the city hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a World's Fair designed explicitly to display its miraculous recovery to a global audience. The same architect who had submitted grand redesign plans for post-fire Chicago, Daniel Burnham, was involved in the vision for San Francisco's rebirth. Destruction, impossibly rapid reconstruction, then a grand exhibition staged for the world to witness. The loop was now running on its own momentum. Let me be honest about something before we go any further. Maybe the connections I'm drawing aren't really there. Gold rush cities grow fast because gold attracts people and people build things. Fires and earthquakes destroy cities, and economic desperation drives extraordinary reconstruction. Human beings under pressure are genuinely capable of things that look miraculous in hindsight. I accept all of that. But the scale I'm describing doesn't sit comfortably inside that framework. Melbourne climbs from 177 people to the wealthiest city in the world in roughly 30 years. Chicago burns down, rebuilds identically, burns again, and then produces the architectural innovation that defines the next century. San Francisco loses 80% of its buildings and replaces them in 3 years while operating under codes that had been cut in half. And then there is the documentation problem, which I cannot resolve no matter how deep I go. Census records exist, building permits exist, newspaper advertisements for construction laborers exist, architectural plans mailed from England exist. What does not exist, not in any of these 3 cities, is the comprehensive construction documentation you would expect for the greatest building projects of the 19th century. Where are the photographs of Parliament House rising stone by stone across the years of its construction? Where are the brick kiln production records for cities that laid tens of millions of bricks within a single decade? Where are the quarry invoices, the labor rosters, the supply chain manifests? Where is the paper trail that enormous civic projects naturally generate, the same trail that modern construction creates obsessively and that Victorian institutions created as a matter of institutional pride? For these buildings, in these cities, during these specific windows of time, the trail is remarkably thin. Every city uses the word founded rather than built. Every city marks its recovery with a World's Fair. And George Train's observation keeps returning to me like something unfinished. He said it with genuine wonder, but wonder has a shadow. Because when you cannot explain how something happened, you have to at least consider the possibility that the story you have been given is not the complete one. These are not theories built on speculation. They are census figures, building permits, insurance documents, and the direct testimony of people who stood inside these cities while it was happening. The only question is whether the explanation history handed us is large enough to contain what actually occurred. If 177 people can produce a city that rivals London in a generation, we should study how they did it in granular detail. If a city can burn twice and invent the skyscraper in 14 years, we should be able to teach that method. If 20,000 buildings can rise in 3 years on compromised codes, we should be able to reconstruct every step of the process from surviving records. But if we cannot explain any of it, if the documented workforce and the tools of the era cannot account for the results, then something is absent from the record. 3 cities, 3 continents, the same sequence repeated with variations so slight they feel deliberate. And the one man who watched it happen in real time, who walked through these cities at the height of their impossible emergence, could only find one word for what he was witnessing: magic. Maybe he was right to be stunned, or maybe the amazement itself is pointing toward a question we have not yet had the courage to ask clearly. The question was never what these cities built. The question is what was already there before they started.